Hey there. Well, we have received so many requests to bring some of these YouTube questions live. We got a lot of questions and comments on this video I did about buying a home without a spouse. The first question was, how can I buy a house without my spouse because we are in a rocky relationship? I don't want a divorce. We are in a community property state. Okay. So specifically, when you are residing in a community property state and you're going to be purchasing a home in a community property state, the home lending guidelines are a little different. And that's what I'm going to speak to. For this person, you can still buy a house, but if you don't want to have your spouse on the deed, so you don't want them to have ownership in the home, then your spouse could sign a disclaimer deed, which essentially just disclaims their interest in the property. They would not be on the home loan. They would not have ownership interest in the property. So that can happen. Now, in rocky relationships, it's not always easy to have that conversation, and it's not always something that maybe the spouse is willing to sign, because technically they have to sign a form, again, disclaiming their interest in a property. So if you have further questions about that, I do recommend talking to a local family law or real estate attorney. They can give you some insight into it. But really, I do think that it's just important to know it can happen, but there's an action that has to happen, and that's not always easy depending on the relationship. So, all right, number 2, my wife's credit is terrible, but she has good income. My credit is good, but I have terrible income. How can we buy a house? I think this really bodes well for a strategic conversation, because first we want to look at what makes your wife's credit terrible. How long ago was that? And are there any little things or big things that can be done to get your wife's credit in a reasonable credit score range where the two of you could qualify together to purchase a home? Because what we know about lending guidelines today is it's not just about credit, it's about income and debt to income ratio. So her income being good is a very favorable component of the home loan process. So first, I would just recommend talking with an experienced lender, having that lender pull a mortgage rated credit report, which is different than what we as consumers access or pull on our own, and let a lender that has experience and credit guidance really dive into and say, hey, you know, here's what's going on, here's what's keeping your score down, here's what you can do to improve your score. And they can also give you a projection on how long it would take based on those actions to get the score to a point where maybe she could be on the home loan. So that would be one option. The second option is that you can, depending on where you live and depending on the relationship, you may want to consider having you go on the home loan, even though your income isn't great. Sounds like your credit is great. So you would be the primary occupant. And then if you have a family member or relative that could co-sign for you and they have income that could be helpful to you to qualify, that could be another strategy, and not have your spouse on the home loan. So again, there's a lot of different angles and different strategies that lenders can kind of walk through once they know more about the story. So don't hesitate to reach out either to us or anybody else in your community that's an experienced home lender, and they can walk you through some different possibilities there. All right, not sure if you see this, but my spouse isn't on the loan, but is on the deed. Why do I have to refi or buy him out? Got a second loan on my house just to use my equity. I don't know what led up to this. I don't know if it was maybe they purchased the house together and the spouse couldn't be on the loan but wanted to be on the deed. Know that is that can happen. So if we have a married couple and for whatever reason it's determined that one of the people are not going to be on the home loan, the person that's not going to be on the home loan can or cannot be on the deed. And this is an important part of the conversation when we're talking with homeowners or wannabe homeowners that are in that situation. We're presenting to them, look, okay, you're not on the home loan, but maybe that spouse maybe it's their money that's being used towards the down payment or the closing costs. So they want to have ownership interest in the property. Well, the way you would have ownership interest in the property is to be on the deed. Now you're legally an owner of the home. So in this case, I can't tell really what led up to getting the spouse on the deed. But now that the spouse is on the deed, technically he has ownership interest in the property. So this, anything you're doing at this point forward, your spouse, because he's on the deed, is going to have to agree to. All right, the next one. I'm the listed person on my mortgage and my husband is not listed anywhere. So what will our situation be if we divorce and we are in Wisconsin? First, I am not an attorney, and I would highly recommend talking to a divorce attorney about this, because the divorce attorney is going to be able to kind of ask you questions such as, how long have you been married? Did you acquire the home prior to getting married? Did you acquire the home after being married? All of those things kind of go into probably the very accurate response here. But because I'm not an attorney, I can't comment on the legal aspect here. At this point, without your spouse on the deed, your spouse technically does not have ownership interest in the property. That doesn't mean your spouse wouldn't have rights to equity in that property, again, based on the state and the situation. That's why I recommend talking to a divorce attorney. All right, next one. I want to sell my home and purchase another with my husband, and I both on the loan. But my issue is his credit is horrible, and his debt to income ratio is not good either. But with both of our incomes, we would qualify for more home versus just my income. So I feel like I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. Is there any advice you can give me regarding this dilemma? Kind of goes back up to the earlier question I answered. And first I would try to dive in and better understand why his credit is so horrible. I have talked to thousands of people over this journey in this industry, and many times people will think their credit is worse than it really is, or maybe they're looking at Credit Karma or some type of credit reporting system, and they're seeing what might be considered a low credit score and determining that that makes their credit profile overall bad. But many times, maybe it's a low credit score for a specific reason or two. So this is why I just can't stress enough the importance of talking to an educated, experienced home loan lender who understands just credit guidance. And they can review that mortgage rated credit report. They can really get into it. We have simulators that we can run scenarios through and say, hey, what would happen to the score if this debt was paid off, or this debt was eliminated, or this late payment was reversed by the creditor? So many different scenarios. So I'd say don't rule that out, because knowing where you stand, if you do that and the lender's like, yeah, I mean, this is really going to be difficult to turn this thing around. It could take a year or two. And just know, I've seen really bad credit get turned around with intentionality and diligence and following the plan. But if you don't have that time and you don't want to invest the effort or the money, then I get it. The next response would be your spouse with that type of credit profile, let's say, could not be on the home loan, it sounds like, again, without knowing the real details and what that really means, but could be on the deed, meaning that if your spouse was going to contribute towards down payment and closing costs and they wanted to have ownership interest in the property and you guys jointly wanted to own that property, there's a way to do that. So they don't necessarily have to be on the home loan to be on the deed. If you decide that's not what is best for you, then you could look to a family member or a relative that could potentially co-sign for you, that could help you qualify for a higher price point, knowing that you're comfortable that you can make the payment because your spouse does have income. My wife is planning to buy some land without my name on the property. Our current mortgage is in my name solely. If she applies for a loan, will I have to send them my mortgage information even if I won't be on the new property? Well, the real question here is, is your wife on the deed to the home that you were on the mortgage for? So if your wife has ownership interest in the property, she may have to provide some documentation about that property. If your wife does not have any ownership interest in the property and you've already stated she's not on the home loan, then there would not be any documentation that would have to be provided, although the lender would just want the explanation. You own the house, your wife does not have ownership interest in the house, is not obligated on the mortgage home loan, and that generally is just the documentation. The lender wants to understand the story. All right, the deed to the house I bought was signed on June 14th and notarized, but the date that the deed was filed and recorded was July 2nd. I got married in between those dates on June 20th. If I get divorced, which is the legal date? The date it was notarized and signed, or the date the recording took place? She is nowhere on the loan or any paperwork since I was in the middle of buying a house when we met. This one is a little complex because technically you don't own the house until that home loan is funded and recorded. That's when you're the official owner. And so the July 2nd date is the date that's going to prevail here. Now, from a legal standpoint, and I am not an attorney, you would probably want to run this by an attorney. What happens in that situation? She's not on the home loan, but it doesn't necessarily mean she's entitled or not entitled to. In hindsight, I don't know if your lender was aware that you were getting married, but when you sign and that deed is notarized in some states, and every state is different. For example, in Arizona, you can sign your loan documents, a week or two before close of escrow. But the close of escrow, meaning the date that the home loan is funded, the date all funds are dispersed, and the date that deed gets recorded, that's the actual funding closing date, and that date would prevail. Well, hopefully that was helpful to you. If you have additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to respond in comments or below, and I'll do my best to give you additional insights as they come up.